Luna's heart hammered against her ribs as silver arrows whistled past her ear. Yet another close call. Too close. Her bare feet pounded against the forest floor, each step sending jolts of pain up her legs. From there, she pushed harder into the darkness of Thornwood Forest. The royal guards were gaining ground, and she could smell their fury. They want me dead. What followed was a desperate leap over a fallen log, her stolen supplies scattering like autumn leaves. Soon after, she heard the thunderous crash of hooves behind her. By the time she glanced back, torchlight flickered between the trees. "There!" Captain Kane's voice boomed through the night. "The traitor Omega!" Luna's breath came in ragged gasps. Not only that, but her shoulder throbbed where the last arrow had grazed her. What's worse, the moonbell flowers she'd risked everything to collect were somewhere behind her now, crushed beneath royal boots. Without warning, her foot caught on a root. As if fate demanded it, she tumbled forward into a cluster of thorns. Because of that stumble, precious seconds slipped away. 5 years of running. 5 years of hiding. For what? As the silence stretched around her hiding spot, Luna's fingers traced the scar over her heart. In that moment, she remembered why she endured this torment. The memory of storm-gray eyes and a voice that once called her name like a prayer. Thane. Her chest ached with the weight of what she'd sacrificed. Truth be told, the pain never faded. It only grew sharper with each passing moon. Before she could lose herself in the memory, boots crunched on dead leaves nearby. Without thinking, her body moved on instinct. As if pulled by a string toward survival, she pressed deeper into the thorns until her skin bled. "Search every shadow," Kane ordered. "King Thane wants her found, dead or alive." The words hit her like ice water. Even so, Luna bit back the whimper threatening to escape her lips. Her wolf stirred restlessly beneath her skin, wanting to fight, to run, to howl her pain to the moon. But I can't. Not yet. Not until the curse is broken. Eventually, the torches moved away. That night, Luna emerged from her thorny prison, blood trickling down her arms. Come morning, she would have to find another sanctuary. As the wind shifted, carrying the scent of her pursuers away, one thought echoed in her mind. The curse was getting stronger, and Thane was running out of time. Deep in the heart of Thornwood, Luna's hidden cave pulsed with otherworldly energy. Moonlight filtered through the crystal formations above, casting ethereal shadows across her makeshift altar. From there, years of painstaking research covered every surface. Ancient texts bound in wolf hide, dried herbs hanging in carefully arranged bundles, and ritual circles carved into the stone floor. Next, she pressed her palm against the jagged wound on her shoulder. The arrow had torn deeper than she'd thought. As a result, crimson droplets splattered across her latest translation of the curse-breaking ritual. "Perfect," she whispered, her voice echoing off the cavern walls. What followed was a memory so vivid it stole her breath. Thane's face contorting with betrayal as she'd rejected their mate bond in front of the entire pack. Soon after that devastating moment, she'd watched the light die in his storm-gray eyes. "You choose him over our sacred connection?" His voice had cracked like thunder. Still, she could taste the lie on her tongue. Yet the truth would have killed him faster than her rejection ever could. Even so, the memory of his pain haunted her dreams. Despite that agony, Luna had spent every waking moment since learning to break the curse that would have claimed his life within days of accepting their bond. On the other hand, sometimes she wondered if letting him hate her was the crueler choice. More importantly, she questioned whether love could truly survive such deception. In fact, the bloodline curse was ancient, woven by a witch whose name struck fear into werewolf hearts. Not only that, but Morgana Ravencrest had designed it specifically to prevent Thane's family from finding happiness. What's worse, accepting a true mate bond would trigger the curse's final phase. To make things worse, Luna had discovered the truth just days before their planned mating ceremony. Moments later, She'd made the most devastating choice of her life, walking away from everything she'd ever wanted. By the time she'd fled into exile, the pack already believed her a traitor who'd chosen a human lover over their future king. Eventually, the whispers had grown into roars of condemnation. But then, during her darkest hour, she'd found hope in forgotten texts. Instead of wallowing in despair, she'd chosen to fight back against ancient magic with forbidden knowledge. Rather than accepting defeat, Luna had become something the pack feared more than a traitor, an Omega who practiced shadow magic. Meanwhile, as she worked night after night to decode curse-breaking spells, Thane continued weakening. At the same time, her own heart withered without the mate bond she'd severed to save his life. Because of that sacrifice, both of them suffered in isolation. As a result, the very love that should have been their salvation became their greatest source of torment. So she pressed on through the loneliness, knowing that success meant redemption. That's why every night spent hunched over ancient texts mattered, which meant she couldn't afford to let despair win, not when Thane's life hung in the balance. Truth be told, the magical components she needed were becoming harder to find. No matter how careful she was, the guards kept getting closer to discovering her hideouts. Maybe it was fate that kept her one step ahead of capture. She didn't know what scared her more, being caught before completing the ritual, or discovering that her magic wasn't strong enough to break a centuries-old curse. Deep down, she knew the truth that made her hands shake as she worked. Time was running out faster than she'd calculated. The border market reeked of desperation and unwashed bodies. Luna pulled her hood lower as she wove between merchants hawking stolen goods and information to the highest bidder. From there, she kept her head down while scanning for what she desperately needed. Next, her amber eyes locked onto a booth displaying rare magical herbs. What followed was the careful approach of a predator stalking prey. Soon after, she noticed the graying merchant watching her with pale blue eyes that held too much cunning. Still, Luna forced her voice into the respectful tone of a traveling healer. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, her wolf paced restlessly. Even so, she gestured toward a bundle of silver sage. "For cleansing rituals," she said softly. "Nothing too dangerous." Despite her innocent request, what she really wanted sat on the shelf behind him. Blood moon root worth more than most pack members earned in a lifetime. On the other hand, admitting she needed it would expose her as someone practicing forbidden magic. More importantly, whispers from nearby stalls reached her ears like venom. "That traitor Omega still runs free. King Thane grows colder each day since her betrayal. They say she's learned dark magic in exile. 1,000 gold pieces for her capture." In fact, each word cut deeper than the silver arrows she'd dodged last night. Not only that, but she could hear the hatred in voices that once welcomed her as their future queen. What's worse, they believed every lie about her choosing a human lover over their sacred traditions. To make things worse, the merchant's eyes suddenly sharpened with recognition. Moments later, his gaze fixed on the scar visible above her heart, where her cloak had shifted. By the time Luna realized her mistake, it was too late. Eventually, she would learn that survival meant never letting her guard down, not even for a second. That night's close call with the guards had left her clothing torn and blood-stained. But then she'd been too focused on reaching the market to notice how exposed she'd become. Instead of calling for help immediately, the merchant leaned closer. Rather than shouting for the guards, he whispered with barely contained greed, "You're her, the one they're hunting." Meanwhile, Luna's pulse thundered in her throat as every instinct screamed danger. At the same time, she felt trapped between running and fighting, both choices that would confirm his suspicions. Because of that moment of hesitation, precious seconds slipped away. As a result, she found herself staring into eyes that saw only profit in her capture. So she let a hint of her wolf show in her amber gaze, voice dropping to a predatory growl. "Let go. Now." That's why smart humans backed down when faced with a werewolf's direct challenge, which meant this merchant was either very brave or very stupid. Truth be told, most people couldn't handle the weight of an apex predator's stare. No matter how much gold they were offered, their survival instincts usually won. Maybe it was fate that this particular human chose greed over wisdom. She didn't know what scared her more, that he would turn her in for the reward, or that his next move would doom them both. Deep down, she knew what was coming before his hand reached for the signal bell. Before she could stop him, the sharp clang echoed across the market like a death knell. Without warning, silver nets dropped from the trees above as royal guards emerged from every shadow. In that moment, Luna realized this hadn't been bad luck. It had been a perfectly laid trap. As if the world tilted beneath her feet, she understood that her 5 years of careful hiding were over. Her heart skipped as Captain Kane stepped into view, his scarred face twisted with satisfaction. A beat later, she made the choice that would change everything. Instead of fighting, Luna threw back her hood and let her true scent flood the market. With his trap sprung perfectly, Kane's voice carried across the stunned crowd. The traitor Omega. Finally. As the air thickened with tension, Luna felt something shift inside her chest. Time seemed to slow as she realized the truth. Being captured might be the only way to get close enough to save Thane. Her voice trembled with 5 years of suppressed emotion as she raised her hands in surrender. As the silence roared around them, one thought echoed in her mind. I'm coming home, Thane. Ready or not. Her breath caught as silver chains burned against her wrists. The space between her old life and whatever came next stretched like an eternity. In the quiet that followed her capture, Luna felt her bones remember the weight of destiny. As the chains tightened, her soul answered a call she'd been running from for far too long. The wind carried whispers of her name, some spoken with hatred, others with confusion. Shadows danced between hope and despair as her wolf pressed forward, eager to see the man they'd sacrificed everything to protect. Her instincts surged with a truth that made her chest ache. The hardest part wasn't being captured. As though fate whispered directly into her ear, she knew the hardest part would be facing Thane's eyes again, and seeing nothing but betrayal staring back at her. The silver chains burned against Luna's wrists like liquid fire. Captain Kane's satisfied smirk made her stomach turn as his men hauled her through the market. From there, curious onlookers pressed closer, desperate for a glimpse of the infamous traitor Omega. Next came the whispers, sharp as knives and twice as cutting. What followed was the longest journey of Luna's life as they dragged her toward Moonhaven territory. Soon after leaving the border market, the familiar scent of home filled her nostrils. By the time they crossed into Packlands, her wolf was howling beneath her skin. 5 years. 5 years since I've been home. Still, nothing looked the same. Yet the trees remembered her. She could feel their ancient recognition humming in her bones. Even so, the silver prevented her from shifting, from running, from doing anything except endure Kane's triumphant parade. Despite her pain, Luna kept her chin high as they passed through the outer villages. On the other hand, she couldn't ignore the shocked faces of wolves who once called her their future queen. More importantly, she saw fear where there used to be love. In fact, some of the younger wolves didn't even recognize her. Not only that, but they stared at her like she was a monster from their nightmares. What's worse, their parents pulled them closer when she passed. To make things worse, Elder Mira stood in her doorway, tears streaming down her weathered face. Moments later, their eyes met across the distance. By the time Luna tried to offer a small nod of greeting, Kane jerked her chains harder. Eventually, the great stone walls of the royal compound came into view. That night would mark the first time she'd seen them since her exile. Come morning, she might be dead. But then something unexpected happened. Her heart began to race for an entirely different reason. Instead of fear, anticipation coursed through her veins. Rather than dreading what came next, part of her was eager to see him again. Meanwhile, the massive iron gates creaked open with the sound of thunder. At the same time, Luna's enhanced senses caught a scent that made her knees weak. Thane. Because of that familiar musk filling the air, her wolf surged forward despite the silver's burn. As a result, Kane had to use both hands to keep her upright. So she bit back the whimper threatening to escape her lips. That's why she forced her expression into a mask of cold indifference, which meant no one would see how desperately she wanted to run toward that scent instead of away from it. Truth be told, 5 years hadn't dulled the mate bond as much as she'd hoped. No matter how hard she tried to sever their connection, her soul still recognized its other half. Maybe it was fate that led her back here like this, captured, chained, helpless. She didn't know what scared her more, seeing hatred in Thane's eyes or discovering that he felt nothing at all. Deep down, she knew the truth that made her breath catch. In a few minutes, she would face the man whose life she'd saved by breaking both their hearts. Before she could prepare herself mentally, the dungeon doors loomed ahead like the mouth of a hungry beast. Without warning, Cain shoved her forward so hard she stumbled. In that moment, as they descended into darkness, Luna felt the weight of destiny settling around her shoulders. As if pulled by an invisible string, she was exactly where she needed to be. Her body moved on instinct, not fighting the guards who unlocked her cell. As the silence stretched in the underground chambers, Luna pressed her back against the cold stone wall. With every heartbeat echoing in the darkness, she waited. In the span of a breath, everything she'd sacrificed had led to this moment. The moment their eyes would lock again after 5 years of painful separation. Without another word needing to be spoken, they would both know nothing between them was finished. Before either could speak, the truth would hang in the air like smoke. As if fate demanded one final test, Luna heard familiar footsteps approaching down the corridor. The tension that had defined her existence was about to snap. One way or another, those footsteps echoed like thunder in Luna's chest. Heavy, measured, carrying the weight of a crown and 5 years of bitter betrayal. From there, torchlight flickered against the dungeon walls as the footsteps grew closer. Next came the sound that made her wolf whimper, keys jangling in a guard's nervous hands. What followed was the screech of metal hinges as her cell door swung open. Soon after, a shadow fell across the threshold. By the time she looked up, her world tilted completely off its axis. Thane. Still magnificent, yet carved from stone and winter storms now instead of the warm man she'd once known. Even so, those storm-gray eyes held the same intensity that had first claimed her soul. Despite the 5 years between them, Luna's body betrayed her instantly. On the other hand, she couldn't let him see how his presence affected her. More importantly, she had to remember why she'd made this sacrifice. In fact, he looked exactly as dangerous as a king should. Not only that, but power radiated from him like heat from a forge. What's worse, she could see the coldness that hadn't been there before. Coldness she'd put there. To make things worse, when he spoke, his voice cut through her like a blade. The infamous traitor returns. Moments later, Luna forced herself to meet his gaze directly. By the time she found her voice, it came out steadier than she felt. "Your Majesty!" The formal address tasted like ash on her tongue. Eventually, Thane stepped into her cell, and the space seemed to shrink around his presence. That night, she realized how much broader his shoulders had become. Come morning, she might not live to see how much more he'd changed. But then his scent hit her full force. Pine and steel and something darker now. Instead of the warmth she remembered, there was an edge of danger that made her shiver. Rather than showing weakness, Luna straightened her spine against the wall. Meanwhile, his eyes raked over her like he was cataloging every change 5 years had wrought. At the same time, she did the same to him. Because of the silver still burning her wrists, she couldn't hide how her pulse hammered. As a result, she knew he could hear the rapid beating of her heart, so she lifted her chin in defiance, even chained and powerless. That's why her voice carried an edge when she spoke. "Come to gloat?" which prompted the first crack in his stone mask. A flash of something raw and painful. Truth be told, it was gone so quickly she almost missed it. No matter how hard he tried to appear unmoved, she'd seen the wound that still bled. Maybe it was fate that made her want to reach for him despite everything. She didn't know what scared her more, that he still affected her this deeply, or that she apparently still affected him. Deep down, she knew this confrontation would determine everything that followed. Before she could stop herself, Luna asked the question that had haunted her. "How have you been?" Without warning, Thane's control snapped completely. In that moment, 5 years of suppressed rage and pain exploded between them like a dam bursting. How have I been? His laugh was bitter as winter wind. You destroyed everything we were supposed to be. You chose some human bastard over our sacred bond. You made me look like a fool in front of my entire pack. As if the words were torn from his chest, he continued, And you ask how I've been? Her heart skipped as she saw the depth of his pain. A beat later, she realized he truly believed every lie she'd let him believe. With the air thick between them, Luna felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. As her wolf stirred restlessly, she fought the urge to tell him everything. Time stood still as they stared at each other across an ocean of hurt and misunderstanding. Her voice trembled when she finally whispered, Thane, if you knew. As the silence roared around them, he cut her off with a gesture sharp as a blade. Her breath caught as she saw something flicker in his eyes, not just anger, but desperate, aching need. The space between them burned with all the words they couldn't say. Her chest ached as she realized the truth. He was still fighting their bond just as hard as she was. In the quiet that followed, Luna made a choice that would change everything. As her wolf pressed forward with sudden hope, she decided to give him a piece of the truth. I never chose anyone over you, she said softly. There was no human lover, Thane. There never was. Her thoughts spun as she watched his face go completely blank. As the echo of her words faded, she knew she'd just lit a fuse that would either save them or destroy them both. Her name hung in the air between them like a prayer and a curse combined. In the stillness that followed her confession, Luna felt the ground shifting beneath everything they thought they knew. Her bones remembered the way he used to say her name with reverence. As her soul answered the pull she'd been fighting, one truth echoed in the darkness. Some bonds were too strong for even the cruelest lies to break. Thane's face went white as Luna's words sank in. No human lover, he repeated slowly, like testing foreign words on his tongue. From there, his storm-gray eyes searched her face for any hint of deception. Next came a tremor in his voice she'd never heard before. What followed was a silence so heavy it pressed against her lungs. Soon after, she watched him process the implications of her confession. By the time understanding began to dawn, his expression shifted from shock to something far more dangerous. Rage. Still. Luna held his gaze without flinching, yet she could see the moment when all his carefully constructed beliefs began to crumble. Even so, she knew this partial truth would only make things worse, not better. Despite her desire to explain everything, she couldn't risk his life by revealing the curse. On the other hand, watching him realize he'd hated her for a lie was almost unbearable. More importantly, she could see how deeply her deception had wounded him. In fact, Thane's hands clenched into fists at his sides as he struggled for control. Not only that, but she could smell the shift in his scent, from cold anger to something raw and primal. What's worse, his wolf was fighting to surface despite his human form. To make things worse, when he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. Then why? Why did you reject our bond? Why did you let me believe? Moments later, Luna's heart shattered at the broken sound of his question. By the time she found her voice, tears were sliding down her cheeks. Because loving you would have killed you, she whispered. Eventually, the truth hung between them like a blade suspended by a thread. That night, she watched him try to process words that made no sense. Come morning, everything would change, but not in the way either of them expected. But then Thane stepped closer, silver chains forgotten as he reached for her. Instead of touching her, his hand stopped just inches from her face. Rather than offering comfort, he seemed afraid she might vanish like smoke. Meanwhile, Luna's wolf pressed forward, desperate for his touch after 5 years of starvation. At the same time, she forced herself to remain perfectly still, knowing one wrong move could destroy them both. Because of the curse still active in his bloodline, accepting their bond remained just as dangerous as before. As a result, she had to resist every instinct screaming at her to close the distance between them. so she memorized every detail of his face instead. That's why she noticed the new lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair, which meant 5 years had aged him far more than they should have. Truth be told, he looked tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. No matter how strong he appeared, she could see the toll her absence had taken. Maybe it was fate that brought her back when he needed her most. She didn't know what scared her more, that he might forgive her, or that forgiveness might come too late to save him. Deep down, she knew the curse was already working on him, even without their completed bond. Before she could warn him about the danger, Thane's expression hardened again. Without warning, the vulnerable moment shattered like glass. In that instant, the king returned, cold, controlled, absolute in his authority. "Treason," he said simply, "conspiracy with werewolf hunters, practicing forbidden magic." As if each word was carved from ice, he continued, "The sentence is death." Her heart skipped as she realized he was protecting himself the only way he knew how. A beat later, she understood that admitting he still loved her would make this impossible. With the air crackling between them, Luna nodded slowly. As the weight of her sentence settled around her shoulders, she felt oddly peaceful. Time seemed to slow as she looked at the man she'd given up everything to save. Her voice was steady when she spoke. "How long do I have?" As the silence stretched into eternity, Thane's mask slipped just enough for her to see the anguish underneath. Her breath caught as he fought an internal war she couldn't help him win. The space between them burned with everything they couldn't say. Her chest ached as she realized this might be the last time they spoke as anything other than king and condemned prisoner. In the quiet that followed, Luna made peace with her fate. As her thoughts spun around the ritual she might never complete, she knew Thane's life was worth more than her own. Her name seemed to echo in the darkness even though he hadn't spoken it aloud. In the stillness of the dungeon, she felt her bones remember what it meant to be his, even if only for a few more days. Her soul answered the call of their severed bond with a truth that made tears fall. She would die loving him, and that would have to be enough. As her wolf stirred with fierce protectiveness, Luna realized she had one last card to play, and playing it would either doom them both or give them the only chance they had left. The wind seemed to carry whispers of ancient magic as she made her choice. Shadows danced between hope and despair as she prepared to risk everything on a desperate gamble. As though fate itself held its breath, Luna opened her mouth to speak words that would change their destiny forever. 3 days, Thane said, before she could reveal her secret. "You have 3 days." 3 days felt like 3 heartbeats when you were racing against ancient magic. Luna pressed her palm against the cold dungeon stones, feeling for the ley lines that ran beneath Moonhaven. From there, she traced symbols in the dirt with her fingertip, crude but effective focal points. Next came the whispered incantations she'd memorized during 5 years of desperate study. What followed was the familiar tingle of shadow magic responding to her call. Soon after, wisps of darkness began coiling around her wrists like living smoke. By the time the shadows reached full strength, her makeshift ritual circle was complete. This has to work. For Thane. Still, working magic while bound in silver was like trying to sing with a knife pressed to her throat. Yet she pushed through the burning pain because his life mattered more than her comfort. Even so, every spell felt like it might be her last. Despite the agony, Luna began the preliminary cleansing ritual that would prepare her for the curse-breaking ceremony. On the other hand, she lacked half the components she actually needed. More importantly, she was running out of time faster than expected. In fact, she could feel Thane's presence somewhere above her in the castle, and his life force was weaker than it should be. Not only that, but the curse was accelerating without their completed bond to anchor it. What's worse, breaking the curse from a distance might prove impossible. To make things worse, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside her cell. Moments later, she quickly dispersed the shadow magic before anyone could see. By the time a guard peered through the bars, she was sitting innocently against the wall. Eventually, the guard moved on, but Luna's heart continued racing. That night, she realized how exposed she was trying to work magic here. Come morning, she would need a new plan. But then an idea struck her. Dangerous, but potentially brilliant. Instead of fighting the limitations of her prison, she could use the castle's own magical foundations. Rather than working against Moonhaven's defenses, she could work with them. Meanwhile, somewhere above her, Thane was probably struggling with the revelations from their confrontation. At the same time, she wondered if he was questioning everything he thought he knew about their past. Because of their severed mate bond, neither of them was whole, which made them both more vulnerable to outside forces. As a result, the curse had more room to work its deadly magic. So she pressed on with her preparations, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges. That's why she needed every advantage she could create tonight, which meant risking everything on a spell that could either save them both or destroy what little time they had left. Truth be told, shadow magic was unpredictable even under the best circumstances. No matter how carefully she planned, something could always go wrong. Maybe it was fate that had brought her here to attempt the impossible. She didn't know what scared her more, failing to break the curse, or succeeding only to watch Thane choose his crown over their bond. Deep down, she knew the truth that kept her fighting. Love this strong didn't just disappear, no matter how many lies had tried to bury it. Luna's blood ran cold as the shadows around her cell began moving independently. What started as wisps of darkness quickly formed into something far more sinister. From there, the temperature plummeted until her breath came out in visible puffs. Next came a voice that made her wolf cower in instinctive terror. Foolish little Omega. What followed was the materialization of a figure that existed somewhere between nightmare and reality. Soon after, Morgana Ravencrest stood before her in all her terrible glory, ancient, beautiful, and radiating malevolence like poisonous perfume. By the time Luna fully processed what she was seeing, it was too late to hide her magical workings. The original curse caster, here, now. Still, Luna forced herself to meet those poison green eyes without flinching. Yet every instinct screamed at her to submit to the predator that had just entered her territory. Even so, she lifted her chin in defiance. "Morgana," she said quietly, "I wondered when you'd make an appearance." Despite her brave words, Luna's heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. On the other hand, facing the witch directly might give her insights she couldn't gain from dusty tomes. More importantly, this confrontation was inevitable. Better to have it on her own terms. In fact, Morgana's laugh was like glass breaking in winter wind. Not only that, but her presence filled the cell with the scent of graves and withered roses. What's worse, Luna could feel ancient power pressing against her mind like crushing weight. To make things worse, the witch circled her like a cat toying with wounded prey. Moments later, those terrible green eyes studied every detail of Luna's makeshift magical setup. 5 years of research, Morgana purred. 5 years of hope, all for nothing. By the time Luna found her voice, it came out steadier than she felt. "The curse can be broken. I've found the way." Eventually, Morgana's expression shifted from amusement to something far more dangerous. That night, Luna realized she'd just revealed more than she intended. Come morning, the witch would use that knowledge against them. But then Morgana leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that seemed to bypass Luna's ears and speak directly to her soul. "Oh, little wolf, you understand nothing." Instead of explaining, the witch gestured toward the shadows on the wall. Rather than normal darkness, they began showing images, Thane collapsing in his throne room, blood trickling from his mouth. Meanwhile, Luna's scream of denial echoed off the stone walls. At the same time, she lunged forward despite the silver chains burning her wrists. Because of that vision, rage flooded her system hotter than any magic she'd ever channeled. As a result, power crackled around her like lightning, making the witch step back with obvious surprise. So Morgana's smug expression flickered for just a moment. That's why Luna pressed her advantage before it disappeared completely. "You're afraid," she realized aloud. "You're afraid I might actually succeed." Which prompted the witch's facade to drop entirely, revealing the snarling creature underneath. Truth be told, Ancient beings like Morgana weren't used to being challenged by anyone, especially not by a lone Omega in chains. Maybe it was fate that gave Luna the courage to speak her next words. She didn't know what scared her more, the witch's power, or the possibility that her own magic might be stronger than either of them realized. Deep down, she understood this confrontation was only the beginning. Elder Mira's footsteps whispered against stone like secrets in the dark. Luna's head snapped up as the familiar scent reached her, lavender and wisdom, tinged with the sadness of watching a beloved student fall from grace. From there, she watched the elderly woman materialize from shadows that seemed to bend around her like old friends. Next came the soft clink of keys that shouldn't have existed in anyone's hands but the guards. What followed was a reunion Luna had dreamed about but never dared hope for. Soon after, Elder Mira slipped into her cell with the fluid grace that came from decades of moving unseen. By the time the door clicked shut behind her, Luna's eyes were swimming with unshed tears. "My dear child," Mira whispered, her weathered hands reaching through the silver chains to cup Luna's face. Still, Luna flinched away from the touch she craved most. Yet the elder's eyes held no condemnation, only the bone-deep concern of a mother for her lost daughter. Even so, Luna couldn't bring herself to accept comfort she didn't deserve. Despite her guilt, warmth flooded through her as Mira's calloused fingers traced the scar over her heart. On the other hand, she knew this visit put the elder in terrible danger. More importantly, if anyone discovered Mira here, they'd both face execution. In fact, Elder Mira had been more than a mentor during Luna's youth. She'd been the mother figure Luna had lost as a child. Not only that, but Mira had taught her everything about werewolf history and magic. What's worse, Luna's exile had probably broken the old woman's heart. To make things worse, Mira looked frailer than Luna remembered, as if 5 years of worry had aged her a decade. Moments later, guilt crashed over Luna like a physical weight. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words inadequate for the pain she'd caused. "For everything. For letting you believe." By the time Elder Mira pressed a gentle finger to her lips, Luna was fighting back sobs. "I know about the curse, child," Mira said softly. "I've always known." Eventually, Luna's world tilted completely as those words sank in. That night, she realized she'd been carrying this burden alone for no reason. Come morning, everything she thought she understood would be different. But then Mira's next words hit her like lightning. "The bloodline curse has been dormant for 3 generations, but it's awakening faster than you calculated." Instead of relief at having an ally, Luna felt terror flood her system. Rather than making things easier, this knowledge made everything infinitely more urgent. Meanwhile, Elder Mira reached into her robes and withdrew a small vial of shimmering liquid. At the same time, she pressed it into Luna's bound hands with desperate intensity. "Essence of starlight," Mira explained quickly. "Distilled during the last blood moon. It will amplify your magic, but only once." Because of this unexpected gift, Luna felt hope spark in her chest for the first time in days. As a result, her mind began racing through possibilities she hadn't dared consider before. So she gripped the vial like a lifeline, meeting Mira's eyes with fierce determination. That's why her voice carried absolute conviction when she spoke. "I can save him," which prompted the elder to smile, the first genuine smile Luna had seen in 5 years. Truth be told, having someone believe in her again made all the difference. No matter what challenges lay ahead, she wouldn't face them completely alone. Maybe it was fate that brought Mira here tonight, at the exact moment when despair threatened to consume everything. She didn't know what scared her more, failing with help, or succeeding only to lose everything anyway. Deep down, though, Luna felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. Luna's trial was supposed to be a formality, a public execution disguised as justice. What she hadn't expected was watching Thane collapse mid-sentence while reading her charges. From there, chaos erupted in the Great Hall as pack members gasped in horror. Next came the metallic scent of blood as crimson trickled from the corner of his mouth. "No, not yet. I'm not ready." What followed was the most agonizing performance of Luna's life, sitting perfectly still while her mate writhed in pain 10 feet away. Soon after, she watched palace healers rush to his aid, their faces pale with confusion. By the time they helped him to his feet, Luna's chains had cut deep grooves in her wrists from how hard she'd strained against them. Still, Thane refused to be carried from the hall. Yet Luna could see the tremor in his hands as he gripped the podium for support. Even so, his storm-gray eyes found hers across the crowd, and for one devastating moment, his mask slipped completely. "Help me," those eyes seemed to plead. Despite every instinct screaming at her to run to him, Luna forced her expression to remain cold. On the other hand, inside she was dying as surely as he was. More importantly, this public display meant the curse was accelerating beyond her worst fears. In fact, whispers rippled through the assembled pack like wildfire. Not only that, but she could hear speculation about poison, about attacks, about weakness in their king. What's worse, some voices wondered if the traitor Omega had cursed him from her cell. To make things worse, Elder Marcus stepped forward with barely concealed ambition gleaming in his eyes. Moments later, he announced that the trial would be postponed until the king recovered. By the time the guards dragged her back to the dungeons, Luna's mind was racing. Eventually, she realized she had perhaps hours instead of days to act. That night, the curse would claim him if she didn't intervene. But then a terrible thought struck her. What if saving him required the ultimate sacrifice? Instead of just breaking the curse, what if she had to take it into herself? Rather than shrinking from that possibility, Luna felt oddly calm. Meanwhile, guards slammed her cell door with unnecessary force. At the same time, she began calculating exactly what she'd need for the most dangerous ritual of her life. Because of Thane's collapse, the castle was in controlled chaos, which gave her the perfect cover. As a result, no one would notice one Omega's magical workings amid all the panic. So she uncorked Elder Mira's vial of starlight essence, feeling power hum against her fingertips. That's why her voice carried absolute determination when she whispered to the darkness, "Hold on, Thane, I'm coming." Which meant tonight would decide everything. Their love, their lives, their very souls. Truth be told, she'd rather die trying to save him than live knowing she'd given up. No matter what the cost, some things were worth any sacrifice. Maybe it was fate that this moment had finally arrived when she had the tools to fight back. Deep down, though, Luna knew the hardest choice still lay ahead, because saving Thane might mean losing him forever. Moonlight streamed through the dungeon's single window, calling to Luna's magic like a siren song. She'd waited until the deepest hour of night, when guards dozed and shadows held the most power. From there, she began the ritual that would either save them both or destroy everything. Next came the careful arrangement of blood, starlight essence, and pure intention. What followed was magic unlike anything she'd ever attempted, reaching through stone and steel to touch Thane's dreams. Soon after, her consciousness slipped free of her chained body like smoke escaping through cracks. By the time she materialized in his chambers, her heart was breaking all over again. He looks so young when he sleeps, so vulnerable. Still, Luna could see the curse's work written in the shadows under his eyes, the gray threading through his hair. Yet something about seeing him peaceful made her chest ache with longing. Even so, she forced herself to remember why she was here. Despite her good intentions, Luna found herself reaching out to trace his face with ghostly fingers. On the other hand, this might be the last time she could touch him, even in spirit form. More importantly, she needed to tell him the truth before time ran out completely. In fact, she'd planned to plant the knowledge in his dreams and withdraw unseen. Not only that, but she'd rehearsed the words 100 times in her cell. What's worse, none of her preparation had accounted for how much she'd missed simply being near him. To make things worse, as she leaned closer, Thane's eyes snapped open, storm gray and fully aware. "Luna?" His voice cracked like he was seeing a ghost. Moments later, she realized her projection was more solid than intended. The starlight essence had amplified everything. By the time she tried to pull back, His hand shot out to grasp her wrist. Eventually, they both froze as his fingers closed around what should have been empty air. That night, the impossible became reality as magic made her temporarily real in his presence. But then the dam burst, and 5 years of suppressed emotion exploded between them. Instead of the careful revelation she'd planned, raw truth poured from her lips. "Forgive me for rejecting our mate bond to save your life." Rather than anger, Thane's face went completely blank with shock. Meanwhile, Luna felt their severed bond trying desperately to reconnect. At the same time, she fought against the pull that wanted to drag her into his arms. Because of her confession, the air between them crackled with possibility and danger. As a result, she watched understanding dawn in his eyes like terrible sunrise. So she pressed on before courage failed her. "There's a bloodline curse, Thane. Accepting our bond would have triggered the final phase. You would have died within days." That's why his grip on her wrist tightened until she gasped, which prompted him to release her immediately, as if her pain burned him. Truth be told, watching him process the magnitude of her sacrifice was more agonizing than the 5 years of exile. No matter how she'd imagined this moment, nothing prepared her for the devastation in his eyes. Maybe it was fate that brought them to this crossroads at the exact moment when honesty might save them. She didn't know what scared her more, his forgiveness or his hatred. Deep down, Luna felt the moment their world shifted completely, because everything they thought they knew had just shattered like glass. Thane's world imploded in the space of a heartbeat. "A curse," he repeated slowly, like the words belonged to a foreign language. From there, Luna watched him sit up in bed, running trembling hands through dark hair. Next came the sound she'd dreaded most, a broken sob from the strongest man she'd ever known. What followed was 5 years of carefully constructed hatred crumbling to dust. Soon after, she saw him begin to understand the true scope of what she'd sacrificed. By the time full comprehension hit, his storm-gray eyes were swimming with unshed tears. "You let me hate you," he whispered, and the accusation cut deeper than any blade. Still, Luna forced herself to hold his gaze without flinching. Yet she could see the moment when grief transformed into something far more dangerous, rage at the situation, at the curse, at the witch who'd stolen their happiness. Even so, when he reached for her again, she didn't pull away. Despite everything, his touch still felt like coming home. "The curse is still active," she said quickly. "That's why you collapsed today. It's accelerating without our bond to anchor it." On the other hand, she needed him to understand the danger before they lost themselves in reunion. More importantly, Morgana was probably watching them even now. In fact, as if summoned by Luna's thoughts, shadows in the corners began moving independently. Not only that, but the temperature plummeted until their breath came out in visible puffs. What's worse, malevolent laughter echoed off the chamber walls. To make things worse, Luna's projection began flickering as something interfered with her magic. Moments later, she realized the witch was trying to sever her connection to Thane. "She's here," Luna gasped, fighting to maintain her form. "Morgana, she's..." By the time the words left her lips, the attack struck with vicious precision. Eventually, Luna felt herself being torn away from Thane, just as his fingers reached for her face. That night, she crashed back into her physical body with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. Come morning, she would bear bruises from the magical backlash. But then, Elder Mira's starlight essence flared around her like protective armor, and Luna realized she wasn't as helpless as the witch believed. Instead of cowering, she channeled her rage into the shadows coiling around her cell. Rather than hiding her power, she let it blaze like a beacon, and felt Morgana's surprise ripple through the magical connection. Meanwhile, somewhere above her, Thane was probably reeling from revelations that changed everything. At the same time, Luna began planning the most dangerous gambit of her life. Because of tonight's confrontation, both sides had shown their hands. As a result, the final battle was no longer a matter of if, but when. So she pressed her palm to the scar over her heart, feeling their bond trying desperately to reform. That's why she whispered to the darkness, "I'm not giving up on us." Which meant tomorrow would bring either salvation or destruction. Truth be told, she'd rather die fighting beside him than live in this half-existence. Maybe it was fate that their love proved stronger than ancient curses. She didn't know what scared her more, succeeding only to lose him anyway, or failing when victory was finally within reach. Deep down, though, Luna felt something shift in her favor, because Thane finally knew the truth, and that changed everything. Shadow creatures poured through the castle walls like liquid nightmares. Luna felt Morgana's attack the moment it began, a wave of malevolent energy that made her silver chains burn white-hot against her skin. From there, screams echoed through the corridors as guards encountered beings that shouldn't exist. Next came the sound of steel meeting shadow with sickening thuds. What followed was the most terrifying display of magical warfare Luna had ever witnessed. Soon after, her cell door exploded inward as Thane burst through, no longer the controlled king, but a wolf protecting his mate. By the time their eyes met, shadow creatures were already stalking down the dungeon steps. Together, he growled, snapping her chains with bare hands that blazed with royal power. Still, Luna's wrists bled from the silver's bite, as feeling returned to her fingers. Yet the moment she was free, forbidden magic surged through her like wildfire. Even so, she hesitated. Using dark magic openly would confirm every accusation against her. Despite her fear, one look at Thane's determined face decided everything. On the other hand, hiding her true self had already cost them 5 years. More importantly, these shadow creatures would kill them both if she held back now. In fact, the first creature that reached them learned exactly why Omegas were underestimated. Not only that, but Luna's shadow magic wrapped around it like hungry serpents, tearing it apart from the inside. What's worse, she felt a savage satisfaction at finally fighting back. To make things worse, more creatures poured down the steps, too many for them to handle alone. Moments later, Thane's wolf blazed silver in the darkness, power radiating from him like heat. By the time they stood back to back, Luna realized something incredible was happening. Eventually, their broken bond was trying to reconnect under pressure, and their combined magic was exponentially stronger. That night, Shadow met Silver in a dance of destruction that shook the castle's foundations. Come morning, nothing would ever be the same between them. But then Elder Marcus appeared at the dungeon entrance, flanked by pack warriors whose eyes blazed with religious fervor. Instead of helping against the magical threat, he pointed directly at Luna. "Witch, she's brought this darkness upon us." Rather than defending her, several warriors moved to surround them. Meanwhile, Thane's roar of rage echoed off the stone walls. At the same time, Luna felt their fragile unity fracturing under political pressure. Because of Marcus's accusations, they faced enemies on multiple fronts. As a result, the shadow creatures pressed their advantage, while pack loyalties split down the middle. So Luna made the choice that would define everything. She stepped forward, shadow magic blazing around her like dark flame. That's why her voice carried absolute authority when she spoke. "I am Luna Ashworth, and I will not hide anymore." Which meant the final battle lines were finally drawn. Truth be told, some fights were worth losing everything for. Maybe it was fate that forced this moment of truth when they needed unity most. Elder Marcus's words cut through the chaos like poisoned arrows. "She practices the forbidden arts," his voice carried across the great hall where they'd retreated from the shadow assault. From there, pack members who'd known Luna since childhood stared at her with growing horror. Next came whispers that spread like wildfire through the assembled wolves. What followed was the most painful rejection of Luna's life, watching her own people turn against her. Soon after, she saw fear replace love in eyes that once welcomed her as their future queen. By the time Marcus finished his accusations, even some of Thane's most loyal guards looked uncertain. "They're terrified of me." Still, Thane stepped protectively in front of her, his voice carrying absolute authority. "Luna saved this castle, saved all of you." Yet Luna could hear the strain underneath his calm exterior. Even so, she knew he was fighting a losing battle against centuries of fear. Despite his defense, Marcus pressed forward with calculated precision. On the other hand, the elder had clearly been planning this moment for years. More importantly, he had pack law on his side, and everyone knew it. In fact, the forbidden magic statute was clear about the penalty for dark arts. Not only that, but practicing shadow magic was considered treason against werewolf nature itself. What's worse, the pack elders had absolute authority to demand immediate execution. To make things worse, Luna could see doubt creeping into some faces she'd trusted. Moments later, she realized that defending her was costing Thane his crown, the very thing she'd sacrificed everything to protect. By the time Marcus spoke again, his trap was perfectly sprung. Choose, my king, your throne or the witch. Eventually, Luna felt her world narrow to this single, devastating moment. That night, she would either gain everything or lose it all. There was no middle ground left. But then something shifted in Thane's expression, from conflicted king to absolute mate. Instead of political calculations, pure instinct took over. Rather than choosing his crown, he reached for Luna's hand with steady fingers. Meanwhile, the great hall fell silent as he made his decision public. At the same time, Luna felt their bond surge stronger than ever before. Because of his choice, Thane sealed both their fates with simple words. Then, I choose Luna. As a result, gasps echoed through the crowd as their king abdicated everything for love. So Marcus's triumph turned to shocked rage at this unexpected development. That's why Luna's heart shattered and soared simultaneously. He was giving up his entire life for her, which meant she had to find a way to save both the kingdom and the man she loved. Truth be told, watching him sacrifice his crown was almost harder than sacrificing their bond had been. No matter what happened next, she would spend eternity trying to prove worthy of such devotion. Maybe it was fate that brought them to this crossroads where only truth could set them free. Deep down, though, Luna knew their real enemy was still watching, and Morgana wouldn't let them escape so easily. Freedom tasted like blood and bitter victory as they fled Moonhaven under cover of darkness. Thane's hand in hers felt like the only solid thing in a world gone mad, but Luna couldn't shake the feeling they were walking directly into Morgana's trap. From there, they moved through forest paths she knew better than breathing. Next came the familiar scent of thornwood, wild, dangerous, and somehow welcoming after the sterile halls of the castle. What followed was the strangest chase of Luna's life, because no one was following them. Soon after, she realized the absence of pursuit was more terrifying than an entire army. By the time they reached her hidden cave sanctuary, dread had settled in her bones like winter cold. It's too easy. Why is it too easy? Still, Thane marveled at her years of preparation, the ritual circles, the ancient texts, the carefully hoarded magical components. Yet Luna couldn't enjoy his amazement because something felt fundamentally wrong. Even so, she began gathering what they'd need for the curse-breaking ritual. Despite her efforts to focus, shadows in the cave corners moved independently of any light source. On the other hand, this had been her safe space for 5 years. Morgana shouldn't be able to reach them here. More importantly, the protective wards she'd carved into stone should hold against any magical intrusion. In fact, Luna was reaching for her most precious grimoire when Morgana's laughter filled the cavern. Not only that, but the witch materialized from thin air with triumphant satisfaction radiating from every pore. What's worse, she looked exactly like she'd been expecting them. To make things worse, Morgana's next words confirmed Luna's worst fears. Did you really think I'd let you run free without purpose? Moments later, understanding crashed over Luna like ice water. By the time she looked at Thane, she could see him reaching the same devastating conclusion. Eventually, they realized the Pack Elder's rejection had been orchestrated. That night, their dramatic escape had played out exactly as Morgana intended. Come morning, they would face the true scope of the witch's centuries-old plan. But then Morgana revealed the cruelest twist of all. I need you together but powerless, little wolves. Your combined magical essence will fuel my ascension to immortality. Instead of trying to kill them, she'd been herding them like sheep to slaughter. Rather than preventing their reunion, She'd been counting on it. Meanwhile, Luna felt their bond pulsing stronger than ever, and realized it was exactly what Morgana wanted. At the same time, Thane's protective instincts blazed hotter, playing directly into ancient hands. Because of their love, they'd become the perfect sacrifice. As a result, every choice they'd made had only tightened the witch's noose. So Luna gripped Thane's hand tighter, feeling his life force weakening by the hour. That's why she made the most dangerous decision of her life, to gamble everything on one desperate plan, which meant trusting that their bond was stronger than any magic designed to destroy it. Truth be told, some traps could only be escaped by walking deeper into darkness. Maybe it was fate that led them here when they finally had nothing left to lose. Deep down, Luna felt the curse accelerating toward its deadly conclusion and knew they had minutes, not hours, before Thane collapsed completely. Luna's hands shook as she arranged the final components of the curse-breaking ritual. Ancient symbols blazed with silver fire around the cave as she poured 5 years of desperate research into one last attempt. From there, she felt Thane's life force flickering like a candle in hurricane winds. Next came the moment when everything she'd sacrificed would either prove worthwhile or utterly meaningless. What followed was magic, unlike anything she'd ever channeled. Shadow and starlight weaving together in patterns that hurt to look at. Soon after, power surged through the ritual circle with enough force to crack the stone beneath their feet. By the time the spell reached its peak, Luna felt victory within her grasp. This has to work. Please. Still, something went catastrophically wrong in the final moment. Yet instead of breaking the curse, the ritual backfired with devastating consequences. Even so, Luna threw herself between the magical explosion and Thane's collapsing form. Despite her protection, the backlash tore through both of them like lightning. On the other hand, she absorbed most of the damage, leaving her magically drained and Thane barely breathing. More importantly, the curse was now stronger than ever, feeding on their failed attempt. In fact, Luna watched in horror as veins of black poison spread across Thane's neck. Not only that, but his breathing became labored gasps that sounded like death rattles. What's worse, she could feel their bond severing completely as the curse claimed him. To make things worse, Morgana's delighted laughter echoed through the cavern. Moments later, the witch materialized with triumphant satisfaction radiating from every pore. Did you really think centuries of planning could be undone by one desperate Omega? Morgana purred. By the time Luna tried to crawl toward Thane, her own strength was completely spent. Eventually, she realized her greatest fear had come true. Trying to save him had only hastened his death. That night, as she watched the man she loved slip away, Luna felt something inside her break beyond repair. Come morning, there might not be anything left worth saving. But then Morgana revealed the cruelest truth of all. Your methods were doomed from the start, little wolf. The curse can only be broken by willing sacrifice, one life freely given for another, instead of hope. This knowledge brought only despair. Rather than finding salvation, Luna had discovered that saving Thane required her own death. Meanwhile, his breathing grew shallower with each passing moment. At the same time, Luna felt the weight of 5 years of mistakes crushing down on her chest. Because of her arrogance, she'd believed love could overcome ancient magic. As a result, she'd led them both to destruction when surrender might have been kinder. So she pressed her forehead against Thane's burning skin, whispering apologies he could no longer hear. That's why her voice broke when she spoke to Morgana. Take me instead, which prompted the witch's coldest smile yet. Truth be told, some victories tasted more bitter than defeat. Maybe it was fate that brought them to this moment when all hope seemed lost. Morgana's offer hung in the air like poison waiting to be swallowed. Your life for his, the witch repeated, circling Luna like a predator savoring wounded prey. From there, ancient green eyes studied every nuance of Luna's expression. Next came the terrible realization that this had been Morgana's plan all along. What followed was the most agonizing choice Luna had ever faced, because accepting would mean never seeing Thane's eyes open again. Soon after, she looked at his ashen face and felt her heart shatter into irreparable pieces. By the time she found her voice, it came out as barely a whisper. "What are the terms?" Still, Morgana's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Yet something about the witch's eagerness suggested Luna held more power than she realized. Even so, desperate times called for desperate measures. "Complete surrender," Morgana purred. "Your essence, your magic, your very soul becomes mine to command. In return, the curse lifts and your precious alpha lives." Despite the horror of such slavery, Luna felt oddly calm about the prospect. On the other hand, living without Thane was already a form of death. More importantly, she'd been prepared to die for him since the moment she'd discovered the curse. In fact, the only thing that gave her pause was imagining Thane's reaction to this sacrifice. Not only that, but she knew he'd blame himself for her choice. What's worse, he might spend eternity trying to reverse what couldn't be undone. To make things worse, Thane stirred weakly at the sound of their voices, just conscious enough to understand what was being offered. Moments later, his storm-gray eyes met hers with desperate intensity. "No," he rasped, using his last reserves of strength to reach for her hand. "Luna, don't." By the time his fingers closed around hers, she could feel how little life remained in his touch. Eventually, she realized they had minutes before the choice became irrelevant. That night, Luna faced the ultimate test of her love, letting go when every instinct screamed to hold on. Come morning, one of them would be lost forever. But then Thane's grip tightened with surprising strength, and he spoke words that changed everything. "We face this together or not at all." Instead of accepting her sacrifice, he was choosing to die with her rather than live without her. Rather than grateful, Morgana looked genuinely surprised by this development. Meanwhile, Luna felt their bond surge with renewed power despite the curse's grip. At the same time, she realized their love might be stronger than any magic, even ancient curses designed to destroy it. Because of Thane's refusal to let her go, they faced annihilation as a united front. As a result, Morgana's certainty flickered for the first time in centuries. So Luna squeezed Thane's hand back, meeting his gaze with fierce determination. That's why her voice carried absolute conviction. Together then, which meant they would live or die as one, exactly as they were always meant to be. Truth be told, some bonds transcended even death itself. Maybe it was fate that their greatest weakness became their ultimate strength. Alone with Thane's dying breath, Luna confronted the ruins of everything she'd tried to build. 5 years of sacrifice, endless nights of research, a love that conquered kingdoms and abandoned crowns. From there, she traced the poison-black veins spreading across his throat like death's own fingerprints. Next came the terrible realization that all her efforts had only hastened the very fate she'd fought to prevent. What followed was the most honest conversation Luna had ever had with herself. Soon after, she faced the truth she'd been avoiding since the day she'd discovered the curse. By the time full understanding dawned, her tears were falling like rain on Thane's fevered skin. "I've been sacrificing wrong. Sacrificing alone." Still, somewhere in her academic mind, she'd always known this moment would come. Yet she'd convinced herself that love could overcome ancient magic through willpower and determination. Even so, watching him slip away proved how naive she'd been. Despite every spell she'd mastered, Luna felt utterly powerless as Thane's breathing grew shallower. On the other hand, maybe powerlessness was exactly what she needed to feel. More importantly, perhaps admitting defeat was the first step toward actual victory. In fact, every great love story and werewolf legend spoke of bonds that required mutual surrender. Not only that, but the strongest magic came from two souls choosing to become one. What's worse, she'd been trying to save him while keeping part of herself separate and safe. To make things worse, Luna realized her pattern of isolation had poisoned everything she'd touched. Moments later, she understood that true love meant vulnerability, not the careful, calculated sacrifice she'd been practicing. By the time this revelation fully settled, Thane's eyes fluttered open one last time. Eventually, she saw him fighting consciousness just to look at her face again. "Luna," he whispered, each word costing him precious energy. "I'm sorry we didn't have more time." That night, as she watched peace settle over his features, Luna made the hardest choice of her life. Come morning, she would either save them both or join him in whatever came next. But then something shifted deep in her chest. Not grief, but profound understanding. Instead of fighting the curse's power, she needed to transform it entirely. Rather than taking his death into herself, she could share her life force with him. Meanwhile, their broken bond pulsed weakly between them. At the same time, she felt the truth that could save them both. Because love was never about one person bearing all the burden. As a result, the curse could only be broken by two souls choosing to trust completely. So Luna pressed her palm over Thane's heart, feeling the irregular rhythm beneath her fingers. That's why her voice carried absolute certainty when she spoke to the darkness. "We're going to try something different," which meant abandoning everything she thought she knew about sacrifice and magic. Truth be told, some solutions could only be found by letting go of control entirely. Maybe it was fate that brought them to this moment when surrender became their greatest weapon. Deep down, Luna felt the curse's hold weakening, because for the first time she was willing to trust completely. Luna's revelation struck like lightning in the darkness of despair. "Not sacrifice," she whispered, her voice carrying new conviction. "Sharing. The curse expects one soul to bear everything alone." From there, she pressed both palms against Thane's chest, feeling his heart struggle beneath her touch. Next came the terrifying decision to trust him with not just her life, but her very essence. What followed was the hardest conversation Luna had ever initiated, asking for help instead of trying to save everyone alone. Soon after, she leaned close to Thane's ear, knowing he could hear her despite his weakened state. By the time she finished explaining her plan, his eyes had opened with fierce determination. "Together," he breathed, understanding immediately what she was asking. Still, this approach violated every instinct she'd developed over 5 years of solitary struggle. Yet watching him rally his remaining strength proved that isolation had been her greatest mistake. Even so, sharing the magical burden meant risking both their lives instead of just her own. Despite her fear, Luna felt rightness settle in her bones like coming home. On the other hand, Morgana's ancient magic was designed to exploit individual weakness, not unified strength. More importantly, werewolf bonds had always been about two souls becoming stronger together. In fact, the curse-breaking ritual required complete vulnerability from both participants. Not only that, but each would have to trust the other with their deepest fears and greatest hopes. What's worse, if either held back even slightly, the magic would consume them both. To make things worse, Morgana watched their preparation with growing alarm, clearly recognizing something she hadn't anticipated. Moments later, the witch began weaving countermagic to prevent their union. "Foolish children," Morgana snarled. "You'll destroy yourselves trying to merge damaged souls." By the time Luna met Thane's storm-gray eyes, she knew they had only one chance to prove the witch wrong. Eventually, she would learn whether love could literally rewrite the laws of ancient magic. That night, they would either transcend everything that had tried to break them or die in each other's arms. Come morning, the world would know if two hearts could beat as one. But then Thane's hand covered hers with steady strength, and Luna felt their bond surge with unprecedented power. Instead of fighting the curse's grip, they would transform it entirely. Rather than individual sacrifice, they chose mutual surrender. Meanwhile, magic began building around them like gathering storm. At the same time, Morgana's expression shifted from confidence to genuine concern. because their combined essence was creating something entirely new, something her ancient spells had never encountered. As a result, the very foundations of the curse began to shake. So Luna squeezed Thane's fingers, feeling his life force flowing into her as hers flowed into him. That's why her voice carried absolute faith. On 3? Which meant they would live or die together, exactly as they always should have. The bonding ritual required stripping away every defense they'd ever built. Luna began by sharing her deepest shame, the night she'd discovered the curse and chosen deception over trust. From there, she let Thane feel the weight of 5 years spent in exile, believing herself unworthy of love. Next came the memories she'd buried deepest, watching him collapse today, knowing her choices had caused his pain. What followed was Thane's response, opening his mind to show her the devastation her rejection had carved through his soul. Soon after, she experienced his rage, his desperate search for answers, the way he'd hardened his heart against any possibility of happiness. By the time he shared his darkest fear, that he'd driven her away somehow, Luna was sobbing. "We've both been carrying so much alone." Still, the ritual demanded even more vulnerability than emotional honesty. Yet as their souls began to merge, Luna felt strength instead of weakness. Even so, Morgana's interference grew stronger with each passing moment. Despite the witch's attacks, Luna pressed deeper into the bond, sharing not just memories, but her very essence. On the other hand, Thane matched her vulnerability with his own, holding nothing back. More importantly, their combined magic was creating something unprecedented. In fact, the curse began unraveling as it encountered unified souls instead of isolated targets. Not only that, but ancient spells designed to exploit individual weakness found no purchase on their shared strength. What's worse for Morgana, their love was literally rewriting the magical laws she'd counted on for centuries. To make things worse, the witch's countermagic was failing against their unity. Moments later, Luna felt Morgana's first flicker of genuine fear and pressed their advantage. "She can't touch what we build together," Luna gasped, feeling their bond solidify into something unbreakable. By the time Thane's wolf merged with her shadows, they'd created a new form of magic entirely. Eventually, silver and darkness danced together in patterns that made Morgana step back with obvious alarm. That night, Luna understood why the curse had seemed insurmountable, because it required 2 people to choose absolute trust. Come morning, they would either ascend to something greater or burn out like falling stars. But then their merged consciousness touched the curse's core, and Luna felt Morgana's trap beginning to crumble. Instead of feeding on their individual weaknesses, the ancient magic found only unified strength. Rather than separate souls to corrupt, the curse encountered something it had no power over: true partnership. Meanwhile, power built around them like gathering lightning. At the same time, Luna felt every barrier between herself and Thane dissolving. Because they were becoming something new together, not Alpha King and Omega, but 2 halves of one unbreakable whole. As a result, even Morgana's centuries of planning couldn't account for love this pure. So Luna squeezed Thane's hand as their souls completed their merger. That's why her voice carried joy instead of fear. "We're ready," which meant facing Morgana as the united force they were always meant to be. Power radiated from Luna and Thane like heat from a forge as they faced Morgana's stronghold. The witch had retreated to the ancient ruins where she'd first cast the bloodline curse, desperate to use familiar ground for her final stand. From there, twisted magic warped the very air around crumbling stone towers. Next came the sound of otherworldly creatures stirring in response to their combined presence. What followed was the strangest journey of Luna's life, walking hand in hand with Thane, while their merged souls hummed with unified purpose. Soon after, she realized their bond had evolved beyond anything in werewolf legend. By the time they reached the outer defenses, Shadow and Silver moved together like dance partners. "We're stronger than the sum of our parts." Still, Morgana's centuries of preparation showed in every trap they encountered. Yet their unified magic dismantled obstacles that would have destroyed them individually. Even so, Luna could feel the witches' growing desperation as each defense fell. Despite their advantage, the final approach tested them in ways Luna hadn't anticipated. On the other hand, every step forward required deeper trust and vulnerability. More importantly, Morgana was using their own bond against them, amplifying their fear of losing each other. In fact, shadow creatures materialized from their deepest nightmares. Visions of Thane dying alone, of Luna's magic corrupting everything she touched. Not only that, but the illusions felt completely real until they remembered to lean on their shared strength. What's worse, some part of Luna still wanted to protect Thane by facing these alone. To make things worse, the curse's final throes sent waves of poisonous energy through their link. Moments later, Luna felt Thane stumble as ancient magic tried one last time to claim him. By the time she steadied him with her own life force, they'd reached the ruin's heart. Eventually, Morgana's stronghold rose before them, a tower of twisted stone that seemed to bend reality around itself. That night, every choice they'd made led to this confrontation. Come morning, either love or ancient hatred would triumph. There was no middle ground left, but then Thane's hand tightened in hers, and Luna felt their bond surge with unprecedented power. Instead of fear, she felt fierce joy at finally fighting beside her true partner. Rather than separate warriors, they moved as one organism with shared purpose. Meanwhile, the ruins trembled as their combined essence challenged Morgana's hold on this place. At the same time, Luna realized the witch had made a crucial error, because Morgana had based all her planning on isolated, desperate individuals. As a result, she'd never encountered souls truly unified by love this deep. So Luna smiled as they approached the final battle, knowing they carried something the witch couldn't understand or defeat. That's why her voice rang with confidence. She has no power over what we've become, which meant victory was no longer a question of if, but how completely they would rewrite the rules of ancient magic. Morgana's tower cracked, like an eggshell, as unified magic met ancient malevolence. Luna and Thane moved as one organism, their merged souls channeling power that made the very stones beneath their feet sing with recognition. From there, shadow and silver wove together in patterns that rewrote the laws of magic itself. Next came Morgana's scream of rage as her carefully constructed stronghold began crumbling around her. What followed was the most spectacular magical battle in werewolf history. Not between enemies, but between love and hatred given form. Soon after, Luna felt their combined essence tear through centuries of accumulated darkness. By the time Morgana realized her error, it was too late to adapt her ancient spells. "Impossible!" the witch shrieked, her poison-green eyes wide with disbelief. "Individual souls cannot merge so completely." Still, Luna and Thane proved her wrong with every breath they drew in perfect synchronization. Yet Morgana's desperation made her more dangerous than ever, throwing everything she had at their unified front. Even so, love this pure created armor that no curse could penetrate. Despite the witch's fury, Luna felt joy blazing through their bond, finally fighting beside Thane instead of trying to protect him from a distance. On the other hand, their shared strength was intoxicating after 5 years of isolation. More importantly, she could feel the bloodline curse dissolving like sugar in rain. In fact, Morgana's greatest weapon, the curse designed to prevent happiness, found no purchase on souls that had chosen complete unity. Not only that, but their merged magic was creating something entirely new in its place. What's worse for the witch, ancient spells were being rewritten by the power of their bond. To make things worse, the tower itself began rejecting Morgana's presence as Luna and Thane's essence claimed the space. Moments later, cracks of silver light split the twisted stone, revealing the natural beauty that had existed before corruption. "Love doesn't conquer," Luna said, her voice harmonizing perfectly with Thane's. "Love transforms." By the time they spoke in unison,
Morgana's form began flickering like a candle in wind. Eventually,
The witch realized she was facing something beyond her comprehension. Two souls who had literally become one while remaining themselves. That night, centuries of hatred met their match in love that refused to be diminished. Come morning, the world would know that some bonds transcended even death itself. But then Morgana made her final desperate gambit, trying to drag them into oblivion with her rather than face defeat alone. Instead of fear, Luna felt Thane's absolute trust flowing through their link. Rather than pulling apart under pressure, they pressed closer together. Meanwhile, their unified essence blazed brighter than any darkness Morgana could summon. At the same time, the curse's hold snapped completely, freeing not just them, but generations of Thane's bloodline. Because true love shared was stronger than any force that sought to divide it. As a result, Morgana's scream of defeat echoed across dimensions before fading to nothing. So the witch's form dissolved like smoke, her centuries of malevolence finally overcome by something she'd never understood. Silence fell over the ruins like a blessing as Morgana's presence vanished forever. Luna felt Thane's consciousness separating from hers, not breaking apart, but settling into the perfect balance of two souls who would never be truly alone again. From there, she opened eyes she hadn't realized she'd closed, meeting his storm-gray gaze with wonder. Next came the realization that they were both still alive, still whole, still together. What followed was the sweetest reunion of Luna's life, Thane's hands framing her face like she was something precious and fragile. Soon after, she felt tears streaming down both their cheeks as 5 years of separation finally ended. By the time he kissed her, Luna knew they'd won something more valuable than victory. We're free. Actually, truly free. Still, exhaustion hit them both like a physical blow as the magical strain caught up. Yet even collapsing felt like luxury when they could hold each other through it. Even so, Luna marveled at how right this felt, not the desperate clinging of earlier, but the peaceful certainty of coming home. Despite their weariness, healing energy flowed between them as their bond settled into its new configuration. On the other hand, they were no longer the same people who'd been torn apart 5 years ago. More importantly, they'd become something stronger together than either could have achieved alone. In fact, the curse's breaking had left them both changed. Luna's shadow magic now shot through with silver light, Thane's royal power tempered with deeper wisdom. Not only that, but their merged experience had given them insights into magic that would take scholars centuries to understand. What's worse, they would have to learn to live with abilities that went far beyond normal werewolf gifts. To make things worse, returning to Moonhaven would mean facing a pack that had witnessed their king abandon his throne for an Omega who practiced forbidden arts. Moments later, Luna realized their real challenges were just beginning. What happens now? She whispered against Thane's chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath her ear. By the time he answered, his voice carried the authority of a king and the tenderness of a devoted mate. Now we go home and show them what love can build. Eventually, Luna understood that they would face the future as equals, not king and subject, but partners in every sense. That night, they slept wrapped around each other like puzzle pieces finally finding their match. Come morning, they would return to Moonhaven hand in hand, ready to prove that some bonds were worth rewriting every rule to protect. But then Luna felt something shift in the magical atmosphere around them. Not threat, but recognition. Instead of fear, she felt the ancient magic of the land itself acknowledging their new status. Rather than conquest, they had achieved transformation. Meanwhile, their love story would become legend among werewolves for generations. At the same time, Luna knew they'd earned the right to write their own ending, because some loves were strong enough to change the world. As a result, Moonhaven would learn to accept the new paradigm they represented. So Luna smiled as sleep claimed them both, knowing tomorrow would bring challenges, but they would face them together. Moonhaven's gates stood open as Luna and Thane approached hand in hand at sunrise.
Word of Morgana's defeat had spread faster than wildfire, carried by the magical resonance that still hummed through the air around them. From there, pack members lined the streets, some with wonder, others with uncertainty, all with curiosity about their transformed leaders. Next came Elder Mira's tearful smile as she rushed forward to embrace them both. What followed was the most important speech of Thane's reign, not as a king demanding obedience, but as a man who'd learned the true meaning of strength. Soon after, he addressed the assembled pack with Luna at his side, their joined hands sending a clear message. By the time he finished explaining their new partnership, even the most traditional wolves looked thoughtful rather than hostile. "She saved us all," Thane declared, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "The shadow magic you fear protected this kingdom when nothing else could." Still, Elder Marcus stepped forward with barely concealed resentment burning in his eyes. Yet Luna met his challenge calmly, letting wisps of silver-touched shadow dance around her fingers. Even so, she kept her power gentle, demonstrating control rather than threat. Despite his prejudices, Marcus couldn't argue with the evidence of their victory. On the other hand, accepting Luna meant accepting that everything he'd believed about forbidden magic was wrong. More importantly, the pack was already beginning to see her differently, not as traitor but as the woman who'd sacrificed everything for their king's life. In fact, young wolves pressed closer with fascination rather than fear, drawn to Luna's unique abilities. Not only that, but mothers who'd once pulled their children away now watched with growing respect. What's worse for the old guard, change was happening whether they approved or not. To make things worse for traditionalists, Luna stepped forward to address the pack directly, not hiding behind Thane's authority but claiming her own space. "I am both shadow and light," she said simply, "both omega and equal. Both your future queen and someone who will never stop fighting for this pack's safety." Moments later, a young girl broke free from her mother's grip and ran forward, offering Luna a handful of wildflowers with shy determination. By the time Luna accepted the gift with tears in her eyes, the symbolism was unmistakable. The next generation was ready to embrace what their parents feared. Eventually, even the most reluctant wolves began nodding approval. That night they held the formal mating ceremony that had been interrupted 5 years ago, this time with the pack's full blessing. Come morning, Luna would begin the delicate work of healing divisions while learning to lead. But then Thane surprised everyone by making one final announcement. From this day forward, shadow magic will be studied alongside traditional arts, not forbidden, but understood. Instead of gasps of horror, Luna heard murmurs of excitement from the younger pack members. Rather than resistance, she saw curiosity beginning to replace fear. Meanwhile, Elder Mira stepped forward with obvious pride, offering to serve as Luna's advisor in magical matters. At the same time, Luna felt the last pieces of her exile finally healing, because acceptance had to be earned, not demanded, and they'd proven worthy of trust. As a result, Moonhaven would enter a new era where love conquered fear and unity replaced division. So Luna squeezed Thane's hand as they stood before their people, no longer king and condemned prisoner, but partners in building a better future. 6 months later, Luna stood before a class of eager young wolves, teaching them to balance shadow and light with patient skill. Meanwhile, Thane ruled with wisdom gained through suffering and redemption, their bond making both of them stronger leaders than either could have been alone. That night, as they ran together through moonlit forests in their wolf forms, Luna marveled at how completely their love had transformed not just their lives, but their entire world. Because some bonds were strong enough to rewrite destiny itself, and theirs would echo through werewolf legend for generations to come.